Welcome back to another episode of Cold Red. I'm Ray Carr, and with me always is Fitz. Fitz, how are you tonight?
I'm good, Ray. We have a full house of guests. Why don't you do some introductions?
We do. Just so everybody knows, this season here at Cold Red, we've been dedicating the entire season to a case that both Jim and I worked. It was called the Center City Rapist case. And we've had some interesting guests that were directly involved in this case and its aftermath. Today, Fitz and I would like to welcome back Philadelphia homicide detective Chuck Boyle. Chuck, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Ray. Hi, Fitz.
Hello.
And Sil Schieber, the father of Shannon Schieber, as we continue to discuss the case regarding the Center City Rapist. Now, in the first several episodes, we've talked about a lot of the things that have transpired in Philadelphia, and we're not quite done with that yet before we get into some of the things that are going on in Colorado. But around the time of the Center City Rapist reign of terror, an investigation was being done by the Philadelphia Inquirer, which found that the sex crimes unit of the Philadelphia Police Department had buried thousands of sexual assault cases over the decades, dismissing women's complaints as groundless with little or no investigation. To help shed more light on this investigation, we'd like to welcome award-winning journalist Craig McCoy to the show. Craig, welcome to the show.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Now, before we get into what Craig was talking about, I know that Sil Schieber wanted to make a statement about something that's been on his mind. So I'll turn this over to you.
Thanks, Ray. Before we get into the main story tonight, I'd like to make a correction of something that was said in episode 5, namely that the contents of the FBI profiler's report played a role in our decision to bring a lawsuit against the city and the police department of Philadelphia. The lawsuit was filed in October of 1998, which was 10 months before the FBI even considered taking the case to its profiler's unit. The profiler's report played absolutely no role in the presentation of our case against the police of the city in the ultimate trial. The police in the city used it selectively with the press in telling how they were involved in handling the case, and the federal judge ultimately ruled that since it was being used in that fashion, we deserved to see what was in it. By its nature, any conclusions were conjectural, and as such could never be used as evidence in legal proceedings. So anyway, we were glad to get it, but it had played no role in the legal process.
And if I can just add here, I was the FBI profiler working the case, and I'm not even repeating myself here, and just so I understand exactly what you said. And it was another agent by the name of Fred Kingston who wrote the report. And I was under the impression for almost 30 years that you had access to that report, and a few of his sentences were not with the sole factors in you and your family filing the lawsuit, but at least contributed to that. And I believe Fred was deposed and maybe even testified at any other hearings involved. But I appreciate you setting the record straight here that, in fact, you had enough information and enough evidence, quite frankly, up front. You didn't even need that report.
The reason it was so appealing to it was his comment that I know was troubling to some of your colleagues. His comment conclusion was so commonsensical. It aligned very much with what seemed brutally apparent to us, but the city in Philadelphia, the attorneys, were desperately trying to tell another story.
Nonetheless, Sil, appreciate you clarifying that for us.
Well, let's move into Craig McCoy. Thanks again, Sil, for that. We appreciate it. Craig, you were part of an Inquirer team that exposed the Philadelphia Police Department's mistreatment of crime victims, especially victims of rape. Craig, again, I want to welcome you to the show. It's a pleasure having you with us. For those unfamiliar with your work, could you briefly describe your role at the time these rapes were going on at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and what led to your investigation of the Philadelphia Police Department's handling of rape cases in the late 1990s?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'd been a reporter. I joined the Inquirer in 1982, and I'd been a reporter for, almost 20 years or 15 years. And I just joined the investigative team at the paper, which was about 8 people. And in 1998, I and my colleagues, Mark Fazlola, who Chuck may know, and Mike Matza had done a project about the overall phenomenon of downgrading of crimes by the police department throughout Philadelphia. And basically this was a way to keep the statistics low if possible and to throw out cases if possible. And there were it was well known in the department, no secret at all, but it never really been written about. It was pretty entrenched, and it was actually somewhat comical. I mean, there was a sign at one police station that said USS Mississippi from Pearl Harbor - lost property. And burglaries were converted to lost property, stolen cars. Shootings would become hospital cases. There are myriad ways to do it, and a lot of police didn't like it. In fact, we were helped by officers who were ordered, in one case, to downgrade crimes, and every time they had to downgrade a crime, they threw the original report in a shoebox, and they ended up giving us that. So they gave us dozens and dozens of downgraded crimes. And we heard in our reporting on that the process extended all the way to sex crimes. That sort of surprised us because, well, for example, we never heard of that in homicide. And we thought rape was serious enough that that wouldn't be done. So we completed the downgrading project in 1998, and without a break, really, we went in to decide to look at the Special Victims Unit in particular. And, there's no magic to it. As you guys all know from your own investigations, I think we began, frankly, by tracking down former members of the unit around the country, and we found them one by one, and they would lead us to others. And again, many were not. They didn't like it. They were not fans of the program, but it was endemic, and they were ordered to by superiors. And they weren't very keen about it, but they did it. And then a real breakthrough came was we met with a disgruntled police officer who had been fired because he was an incompetent investigator, and he was angry at the department. And we met with him, and it turned out he was within the unit. This was the early days of computers, and he was the guy that everybody went to for help with their reports. And when we met with him, he went up to his daughter's bedroom and found a computer that was used by the unit that he had given to his daughter. It was an antiquated, out-of-date computers, and handed it over to us and said, there are hundreds of reports on here that have been downgraded. And we had to go to thrift stores and find a PC that would print from it. And when we did, we got all of these accounts, the police 52s, as they're called, and 48s, all stamped with this code, investigation of person. And we then began talking to the women that were in the reports. And, with almost without exception, they were delighted. Delighted's not a great word, but they had no problem with talking to us because they were upset. Typically, they'd been attacked and they'd made a report and then nothing. And often the unit fell out of contact with them. So it surprised us. But we did, should say, a fourth reporter, Clea Benson, joined us because candidly we thought it would be useful to have a woman involved as well, because these were pretty, I don't have to tell you guys this, but these were very sensitive interviews. And so we began to put the story together, and we were really far down the road with it when Clea got an anonymous phone call. To this day, we don't know who it was, but I think it had to be a police officer. And he said to her, she had covered the police and worked out of the roundhouse. So somehow I think her name and number was in circulation. And he said to her, this was after, I'm trying to get my chronology straight. I guess this would have been after the last 2 attacks before Shannon was killed. And he said to her, it's a shame about those girls, because if the department had paid attention to the earlier crimes, they would have been on this. And then he hung up. But he gave us the block. And he gave us the street. And I went to a friendly commander in the department, and he found the 48 for me almost immediately. And he was very senior. So I just want to make a point. There were a lot of people that helped us with this. And we went and we confirmed it all. And that would be Abby. We talked perhaps to her. That was a little unclear, but she never really participated. She sort of deputized friends to assist her, and later her lawyers. So with that, we had the makings of a story, and we had a variety of accounts. And then for us as reporters, an absolutely pivotal event was the briefing by you guys at the church. That's when Fitz and Ray, I think you were both there for the unveiling of the profile report. Jim, I think you and I may have talked that night. I was looking over our coverage and we quoted you at one point, and it's a long time ago. But at that meeting, you guys probably saw it too. We saw the first victim speaking very intently with Fred Kingston. Was it Fred who delivered the actual report?
Well, he wrote the report. It was at least parts of it early on supervised by me, then his unit chief. But I was the one at the church.
Oh.
To go back to that, I was the one that gave the presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, duh. Well, we watched, and you were. I mean, it was very dramatic to us. We didn't eavesdrop, but from a distance, we could see that she approached you and was extremely emotional. And
yes.
We approached her and her father afterwards, and she, again, like the other victims, very much wanted to talk to us. And she came back. We walked back to her office, which wasn't far from the church. And I remember, as you guys probably saw too, she had a Polaroid picture of her face after the attack, and it was upsetting. Her eye was so badly bruised. So that story began to fall together. And we took those two cases to the police department, and I guess to the department's credit, they ran fresh DNA checks, and that's when the pattern began to emerge. And we were actually going to incorporate all of this into a project about the overall phenomenon of the department. The department moved so swiftly, and Timothy had the police commissioner at press conferences laying out every aspect of the matches, so we ended up writing hurriedly. And then we did the larger project. And as I mentioned, we found police that were once with the unit, and they said, 2701 was used as a trick to hide a case. And one guy said, well, if it was a bad neighborhood or you had trouble reaching a victim, you would dump it. The simple math was if you take those cases out of the equation, you could improve your clearance rate. As I mentioned, I'm sure, I don't know if Chuck, I bet you would agree, right? Commissioners for years have been fooling around with this stuff.
I'll tell you, and I'll just make a point, maybe you, Craig, you'll remember. But I knew in the department, we all knew, like, a robbery was a theft until you had a suspect. Then you could change to 48 and upgrade it. But in 1980, they did away with detectives handling sexual assaults and rapes and everything else because of that problem of not believing the victims and stuff. Because the detective would be handling a burglary or a robbery, and next thing you know, he's interviewing a woman. They didn't have that expertise.
Yes.
So they started the sex crimes unit.
That's correct.
And that became the sex crimes unit up until Timothy blew it up and made it the special victims unit. But nobody in the department, I mean this, would have ever thought that they went back to the old way of downgrading sexual assaults, rapes of women and stuff. I mean, anybody I worked with, because in homicide, I was a detective in North Central, but then when I was a detective in homicide, I mean, kind of tough to downgrade a homicide.
Yes.
So I would have never thought that our department, and of course, as it turns out, through this whole case and after Shannon's thing, what went on. And I mean, we were shocked.
Quick anecdotes, not to get in the weeds, but Chuck, who was the inspector in charge of homicide for years and years? He was
Jerry Kane.
Yes, thank you. Jerry Kane was very good to the press. I mean,
yes,
we all.
He was a good inspector.
He was helpful. He seemed to understand what we were doing. And Jerry, I talked to Jerry about this, and he told me a story that I thought had to be apocryphal. He said there was a detective. It was called The Doctor. This is in the 70s. And this guy he was not in sex, this is before sex crimes, but he would show up around the city at different detective divisions when there was a rape victim wearing a doctor's white coat and with one of those surgical, those circular things that, in the cliche Dr. Kildare. And in quote, inspect the women for, and again, I couldn't process it. But I found it. I went to he gave me enough, Jerry did, that I went to the CJC and I found the actual arrest report. And it was as he described it. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this. It's unbelievable. And he was arrested by the department and the charges were dropped. And I never wrote it because I should have. I could never find the woman. It was a young woman who was the complainant against him. But as I shared with you guys earlier, one thing we learned in the investigation is we filed a Freedom of Information Act with the FBI for its dealings with the Philadelphia Special Victims Unit. And it's kind of a Hail Mary thing, but to our shock, they sent us an exchange of correspondence, and shortly after the unit was founded, what happened was the FBI questioned the fact that at that point, the unit had an unfounding, deeming false, I guess, 52% of all rape complaints, sexual assault complaints, and the FBI was kind of stunned by that number, which even for that era was really high. And in response, the department sent the FBI a 4-page letter listing like 40 different reasons that women lie about rape. And it's an amazing document. I mean, it's insanely detailed. And the common denominator of every complaint is that women were liars. And you had to be impressed by the ingenuity of whoever wrote it because it was so comprehensive. But it included people who said that extraterrestrials were raping them, or people came out of TVs. It also repeated something we heard, which is that they were lies to get a free abortion. That was another idea that was pretty prevalent. So after the FBI raised this concern, that's when, Chuck, the department switched. They dumped that unfounding rate and they drove it right down to around 16%. But instead, they just recoded the cases as investigation of person. So they reverted back to the old, somebody must have known of the old code. So, and then they were comfortable with that for 20 years. When we published, the police commissioner, John Timoney, who I happen to really like and admire, his response was mixed in that his instinct was always to defend his force and his people. I think it's fair to say. And, and he could be pretty caustic with us. And, but on the other hand, he didn't just drop it. He looked into it. He correct crime coding was a key element of his crime fighting strategy, especially with the CompStat process. So he took it pretty seriously, and it all climaxed in a city council hearing where he defended the code and did say, some reports came in that were bogus, but he basically said, the famous quote that I remember is to the effect, he said, look, I'll stipulate that some victims were treated badly, horribly. And, he implemented a series of reforms that continue today. The sex crimes unit used to be, it might still be physically there, but it was at the Frankfurt Arsenal.
Right.
It was a really beaten up, horrible space. It was so narrow that victims and assailants had to cross each other's path in getting to the interview rooms. And it was sad, I saw it, and, kids would come in there and there was like graffiti inside. And anyway, he rebuilt that. They built a new one from scratch, and it has what is called a co-located facility, which means detectives and social workers work together. And this is important because, particularly with children, if possible, you don't want to have multiple interviews from everyone involved with what happened, because it's traumatizing for the people. And so better to, have a facility where police can join together. To digress for a minute, and again, I'd be interested in Chuck's perspective here, but what we heard was the sex crimes unit was a coveted position because you were in plain clothes, but you didn't have to pass the detective exam. And if you were, especially if you'd been in the force for a while, maybe you were trying to build a resume and an appearance for private industry, it's kind of good to get out of uniform and be essentially treated as a detective. And what one result was, it took some pull and juice to get into the unit. So that meant people were getting in not necessarily on straight merit, but on who they know. So,
well, when they first came up with it, like when they blew it up, or I shouldn't say blow it up, when they did away with the divisional detectives handling sexual assaults and rapes and everything, and they formed the sex crimes unit, it was run by a chief who became chief of detectives later. He's an inspector, Roselli, right? Who was a guy that wasn't a big fan of detectives. He was the guy that always said, he would. I remember when I made a detective, he said to all us detectives, he said, as far as I'm concerned, you're all thieves, but I'm not going to get you. I'm going to get your supervisors. Remember that. And don't ever carry an umbrella, right? So, we all looked at each other and said, wow, that's a congratulations. But why he set it up that way was he did put detectives in it and he put police officers. But what happens is with a detective, you can always send them to a detective division, right? So you move them out of one plain clothes to another one.
Yeah.
But with a police officer, if they don't follow what he wants, he could put you back in uniform, put you like a, You lived in the 8th district, he'd put you in the 12th district. So that was his way of that. I mean, he actually went to the commissioner and said, this is what I want to do. I'll have more control over what goes on in that unit because, a detective, you put him in West, he's still, he's still in plain clothes. And
Chuck, he signed the letter I talked about to the FBI. That I'll send it to you, but that came out under his signature. So
Roselli's?
Yeah, that's so interesting. What kind of man is he still alive or is he?
No, he passed away.
Yeah.
But he was a. There were like you say, these were the guys that came along like Jerry Kane and Roselli and those kind of guys that they were old style, no nonsense. There was a few of them.
Well, when they started out, their commissioner was probably Frank Rizzo.
Well, they under Rizzo, but
no doubt about it,
in his 60s, and and a lot of these guys, like Jerry Kane, when he came on, was in the 50s, and Jerry was always a pretty educated guy.
Yes,
real smart, and if you ever saw him when he dressed, he always wore a hat. And that's because when he first made detective in the 50s, a detective's uniform, you had to wear a white shirt, a tie, and wear a hat. So they used to call it the Hat Squad.
I do remember the hats. Yes, I forgot. I never understood it because it seems so antiquated. Yeah.
That was part of the uniform. They had to wear a hat. God forbid you got caught without a hat on, but just don't get caught with an umbrella. Carry an umbrella.
Well,
now,
and then
I want to throw something out here. Craig, I'm going to throw something out to you.
Yeah.
Craig, I want to throw something out based upon a letter that you sent over about the 52% of rapes being considered unfounded. I did a little digging on my own and found out that the FBI uniform crime reports between the 80s and the 90s, they had a category in there that was set for unfounded rapes. And during the 80s and 90s, the FBI reported that between 2 and 8% of those reports were classified as unfounded. But there was a note, there was an asterisk that said, unfounded does not mean false. It includes cases that lack sufficient evidence or cases that were dropped for reasons such as a victim withdrawing their cooperation. A lot of things in the 80s and 90s during that sexual assault era within law enforcement, it was heavily influenced by myths of rape, such as victim blaming.
That's really helpful to know.
Right. When the witness withdraws now, aren't those considered exceptionally clear?
You know what? That's up to the department. It should not mean that. It should just mean it's put on the back shelf. It's unsolved, but it should mean that it's cleared. To me, it's not clear because someone. Go ahead, Chuck.
What I was going to say about exceptionally cleared, you have to get the permission of the district attorney to exceptionally clear a case. So what you would do is you would, like in homicide, sometimes, you have two guys with a gun and one guy shoots the other guy. One guy was quicker, but you could arrest either one and one guy lives, or you're going to clear the job like a neighbor shoots a burglar or something. You have to go to the district attorneys just like you would prepare an affidavit and present all your evidence. And then the district attorney's office will sign off on exceptionally clear. But the department itself cannot exceptionally clear anything. They have to get approval from the district attorney's office.
Well,
and listen, we all know that, and I believe you guys would know better than me. I mean, it might have been in the 90s, thousands, and Philadelphia Police Department was getting ready to be thrown out of NCIC, PCIC because of going down with jobs. They basically told the department, you're on the clock. If you don't straighten up your crime statistics, you're out.
I didn't know that, Chuck.
In the last episode, I think, we talked a little bit about the audit that they did on 95, 96, and 97. When they got finished with that audit, it showed that Philadelphia, the actual number of rapes that should have been reported in 95, I believe were 31 or 32, should have been 31 or 32% higher. In 96, it should have been about 34% higher. In 97, the FBI came in and told Philadelphia they needed to cut out using 2701. And so they should have only been 27% higher that year. Across those 3 years, the number of rapes that should have been reported should have been 32% higher than they were. Awfully big number. 32 is a pretty big number as well. I mean, there was still a lot of chicanery going on in that department.
I can tell you guys this, that in all my training and all my time in law enforcement, and Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, but a false reporting of rape is rare, okay? And
The empirical studies I've seen, it's 1% to 4%.
Yeah, but the real problem here is not over reporting of rapes, as the Philadelphia Police Department was espousing at like 52%. That's why they're dismissed. It's underreporting of rapes.
Right.
People don't come forward with rapes. That's the problem with this thing here.
That's a good point.
Partly the reason is the turmoil they go through when they do.
Right.
And the way they're treated.
Well, that's obvious. That's why we're sitting here having a talk.
They're being re-victimized all over again.
You know,
when they get interviewed, they're being re-victimized.
I mentioned this investigator who was kicked out because he was so bad that we interviewed. He told us with a laugh that within the unit they called themselves the Lying Bitches Squad. So, Chuck, this was Roscoe Kofeld. I don't know if you remember that name. Yeah,
I do.
Yeah. I think he was fired because he arrested a teenage boy for rape and never dusted for prints or did any real investigation of the scene. And when they did it later, the boy was exonerated.
So
there were other cases that he ran that were shocking.
If you look at the sex crimes investigation report on Abby, in terms of what they did, they checked the NCIC records, the PCIC records. They went to Bureau of Motor Vehicles. They weren't looking for the guy that attacked her. They were investigating her, and when she came up clean, they coded her 2701.
Now, the last piece of the reform picture I want to mention is that, and this was Timony's boldest move, was he permitted women's groups, feminists really, to review the files of the sex crimes unit and at random, like pull cases and review them, and they've been doing that for the last quarter century. Every year they do it, and it's called the, quote, Philadelphia model, and other departments have adopted it. So you have to give him, I think. If
I remember at that time, it was him and the chief of detectives, who I think was one of the best chiefs ever, was Jack Maxwell. And they were the ones that got together and said, enough, sex crimes is out, it's special victims. They put Inspector Kirshner in and Captain Mooney. They changed the whole way the thing operated. They put new people in it, and Tommy McDevitt and Mike Boyle as the lieutenants in the special SIU unit. And, I mean, they changed that whole thing. And then they also went back and looked at old cases. They started running the DNA. They made a lot of arrests on that. All stuff that was sitting there, and they went back and reviewed it. So,
and then lastly, then I'm kind of done, but I just want to add, and as I'm sure you guys are aware, just opening our lens up a little bit. This phenomenon of disbeliefs of victims is a national problem. Like clockwork, we learn about major American cities every year somewhere where a scandal has erupted because victims were disbelieved. And Sel pointed out to me one of the most shocking was in Cleveland, where a rape victim escaped her attacker, pounded on the outside of a patrol car, pointed out the man who had served a long prison sentence for rape, and they didn't believe him. They didn't believe her, rather. And then a year passed, he killed another woman, and then they ended up finding 11 bodies at his house.
That was Thomas Sowell.
Thomas Sowell. He died in prison. That takes the cake.
Wow.
Upon reading Roselli's letter, and there's dozens of examples of why they were considering these sexual assaults unfounded, just playing devil's advocate, it's possible there was one example of each category somewhere over a couple of decades where someone said this, that, or the other, but you don't set policy by exceptions to the rule. And that's where they made their mistake. Every case has to be looked at seriously, full investigation. And as we said in earlier episodes, maybe in a week, maybe in a month, investigation will prove one thing or the other. the exceptions cannot dictate the rule or the policies. And that's where their mistakes were, not just in Philly, but in many other departments also. The mayor, from the mayor on down, it's not just the cops doing this, as we know.
No, it's not.
Deputy mayor, chiefs of police, commissioners, whatever, the police are forced to, in some cases, they have to do it this way, especially during an election year.
The only thing I want to add is
oh, go ahead.
I'll finish, but just nationally. So a couple years ago, 2 years ago, the Justice Department announced an inquiry into the New York Special Victims Unit for all this, exactly the same stuff. It's all the same. And I don't know, sometimes the Justice Department moves really slowly because it's still not done. But, Trump has already canceled several of these Justice Department inquiries of police departments around the country. And the New York Times had a story recently that everybody in New York, is bracing for that investigation to be just shut down too. So I've only put that out to say it's 2025 and the same problems are still persisting in many American cities. It's a tough one to fix.
And I always thought you could always tell certain captains that would come in and they were no nonsense. It was, I had one who was Dick Kirshner, who took over Special Victims, who told me, he says, I got wanted, when I first made detective, he was my captain in North Central. And you had to go in and be, and sit down with him, and he talked to you. And he said, I got one piece of advice for you. Do your damn job. And no messing around. Do your damn job. And I mean, there were other guys that, I guess maybe they were trying to curry favor or whatever. But I think what happened in the big change is when Timony brought in that the Comstat, because bosses used to, they almost had nervous breakdowns getting ready to go in there, because if they would get nailed if they fudged anything.
I went to some of those, Chuck, and they were nerve wracking.
For those bosses, it was like the Inquisition.
Yeah, no, it was brutal. I'm trying to remember, there was a particular inspector who ran them, and he was really tough.
Frank Pryor.
Yes, Frank Pryor.
Yeah.
He was also very witty. He was very sarcastic.
He was sarcastic.
But,
don't get caught in a lie with him.
But the captains, it was fascinating to watch because it really forced them to be on their toes and they identify patterns and things. It was pretty impressive. It's still going on, right?
Yeah. As far as I know. I know a lot of lieutenants didn't bother taking the captain's test just because of that.
Oh, yeah. It didn't look like a lot of fun.
Better stay a lieutenant.
Yeah.
And Craig, not to bring up politics, you kind of did, but most of these big cities have been Democrat run for half a century.
Yeah.
I mean, there are judgment calls made arguably on both sides. So
I agree.
And certainly Philly in that regard.
I don't want to lay this just on the police because
that was my point.
Yeah, no, these kind of edicts about numbers came from the top a lot of times, from the mayors themselves. Absolutely, there was there were so many ways you could manipulate it. The classic was simply to truncate the time that you were counting. That was done. That was a blatant lie, but you just give 10 months of figures, not a year. And lo and behold, you had a decrease. So,
well, it was amazing in this case, the paperwork that we were reviewing, where the FBI, the Pennsylvania State Police, and the Philly PD sort of had an ongoing written dialogue in which Philly PD had to explain. The FBI asked the state police, who runs the uniform crime reporting in the state, every state police agency does in the country, and they're saying, wait a minute, you've got a real outlier here with Philadelphia. Can you explain that? So the Philadelphia PD had to answer questions of the state police, eventually got back to the FBI. And Ray, you and I as special agents, or even as a profiler, we wouldn't be involved directly in this, but we certainly do have to know these were the manipulations and machinations going on back in the day. And I'm glad our former agency said, can you try to explain these numbers to us? And and it was a poor excuse. Again, maybe there was one example of everything Roselli put in that letter, but they were clearly the exceptions to the rule, and the coding policy should not have been set on that.
Yeah, the FBI letter of inquiry was a model of restraint too. It was very cleverly worded.
Yeah.
To not, to not point an aggressive finger while still asking a question. So
pointed questions at the same time. Yes.
Chuck, I got to tell you, this is the first time I heard from anyone that when it was finally ended in '97, that was actually ordered by the FBI. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. I remember they were put on notice.
Okay. Did not know that.
Folks, we have some more to talk about here. Would you be willing to come back for another episode? I know this case is ongoing, and we want to hear more from you. Yeah, our producers were in touch with the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, and they have a public service announcement. And for the rest of the episodes we do in this case, we keep saying Center City Rapist case, but as everyone knows, it wound up metastasizing to Fort Collins, Colorado. But the RAINN people, RAINN, wants us to put this out there, and I know we're all in agreement. And that is the following. If you or someone you know has experienced sexual assault, you are not alone. RAINN's National Sexual Assault Hotline offers free, confidential 24/7 support in English and in Espanol. And if you want to get that assistance, call this number, 800-656-HOPE. That's 800-656-4673. And you can chat at hotline, RAINN.org, that's RAINN with the extra N.org, or text HOPE to 64673. So women or men, girls or boys, if you feel you have a sexual assault issue, incest, that you need to talk to someone, call those numbers, and we'll put them on our website too. And just look up RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. And everybody, we're going to sign out of this episode of Cold Red. We will be back with more information on this case, these ongoing cases. And please subscribe, like, and follow us on coldredpodcast.com. Thanks to Matt McLaughlin, Matt Robinson, our producers, Rick Schilling, our music producer, Ray Carr, thank you, our guest, and everyone. Jim Fitz here. We'll see you next time on Cold Red.